Welcome to Marketing Demystified, the podcast that connects the dots for business leaders to drive revenue through effective marketing strategy. We chat with marketing experts on different topics that will help you ramp up your revenue. We stream live on LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube, and you can listen to us on your favorite podcast platforms. Marketing Demystified, the podcast, is presented to you by GrowGetter, your partner in growth marketing. And here's today's episode.
Hello, everyone. Are you ready to be inspired, informed, and empowered with actionable tips to transform your marketing game? You're in the right place. Welcome to Marketing Demystified. I'm your host, Gemma Kusi, CEO and co-founder of GrowGetter, your growth marketing partner. Now, you can trust me that trust matters. In a world where skepticism runs high and attention spans run low, how can B2B marketers build genuine connections, actual trust, and in turn drive growth? That's what we'll uncover with our guest, Philipp Kristian, an international keynote speaker and luminous global voice on trust. Philipp has spent a decade in Fortune 500 digital innovation, advised unicorn status tech companies, and authored 2 books on trust as the superpower of humanity. He's here to inspire us to mind distrust and win with trust. Welcome to the show, Philipp.
Thank you so much.
So excited to have you on. I had the pleasure of hearing your keynote at Customer Congress in Athens over last month in September. And I thought it was a really interesting sort of concept that maybe fewer people are talking about. And so I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today. Thank you so much.
This is beautiful to close the loop because I found that to be a very interesting congress. And today we can make it really relevant, how trust fits into your picture.
Absolutely. So you talk about this concept of winning with trust. Can you explain to the audience what that means, especially in the context of marketing and B2B?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I like winning with trust. I believe that trust is a default in humans, that we like trusting environment, and also quite naturally that it is hard sometimes to trust. And so winning with distrust also is quite hard, and it feels, just for a moment, if we were to feel that, it feels different. And so as humanity, we have the ability to do both. It's just that with distrust, it's sort of a fear type of response. And in a fear type of response, we collectively become a little bit less intelligent and a little bit less collaborative. With trust, our intelligence and collaboration are where they should be, which is really allowing us to do big things. And that's why I personally prefer to win with trust, and I think it's valuable.
Now, what do you think could you share an example of what that looks like to win with distrust versus winning with trust?
A classic example would be to withhold information that actually could be valuable to be shared. Another classic example would be if you were to look at a person as not yet having met a certain standard that you expect of them, for instance, as a leader, or if you look at your competitors and you think, we are so much better. So then what happens is there is a sort of distrust that you put into the picture, and whilst that may be very helpful in the short term, it does have side effects. However, if one is really at the level of winning with trust, it really changes one's perspective on the world. Then I see my competitors as interesting inspiration, but also as a representation of how things are, and that I can possibly invite something new and fresh into the industry. And perhaps when I do so, the industry can change for the better, and that could actually rejuvenate an industry that might otherwise be maybe on the way down or maybe struggling. And I think nowadays, I feel that a lot of people are struggling with complexity and ambiguity. But this is actually to say that what we are doing is we're struggling with the reaction, the response to these concepts. And when we can maintain an attitude of trust, even in an environment where our natural fear and distrust patterns kick in, then we have a chance to really win. Because then we are able to lift ourselves a cut above and uplift the rest of our industry, our people with us. Yeah.
That's such a difficult mind shift to have, right? To go from I don't know, just as you're describing, it sounds lovely. It sounds wonderful to kind of move um, from this complexity, right, and fear that you talk about into a place of more positive outlook and more, sort of, I guess positive outlook is how I'm thinking about it, and especially in today, just what's happening in the world and the way technology is evolving. It seems like a really difficult leap to make if you're really stuck in that complex area.
I agree that it seems like a difficult leap, especially when the cliff has no safety net and you're basically thinking of it as a leap of life and death, which then our bodies respond a certain way when that happens. Perhaps you remember the sort of exercise that we did at the very beginning of the keynote. It's sort of a 2-minute, more or less, a give or take exercise where the invitation is to go to a moment of happy memory, and then to ask certain inner reflective questions about that experience of this happy memory, such as, asking oneself, how is time passing in that moment? Or how old or young am I feeling in that moment? Questions like that, questions of where do I experience myself in that moment in the body? Or even, how do I perceive my environment? How large or small am I relative to the environment? What this does is it very quickly and quite intuitively gives us an opportunity to lean into our natural ability to trust, because what we are doing is we're creating a sort of inner safe space. And as it turns out, 2 minutes may be a long time in some cases, but 2 minutes can be a really short time when we are in a different place of mind where perhaps distrust is a pattern that we notice in ourselves or in the world, or a meeting is going totally south. If we then take those 2 minutes to get back to a place where we experience trust, that intuitive ability actually travels with us. And so I totally agree with you that it can be experienced as difficult. At the same time, tools exist, and I'm very, 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 very insistent on that. Tools exist that allow us to very quickly reach this state of trust that we are often experiencing, and beautifully bring it with us, which means bring it to the situations where it can be very, very helpful. And in a world which, as we described, is full of skepticism, full of patterns which are challenging, this can be very useful. It can even, funnily enough, be useful in dealing with a world of distrust. Because when we can maintain a position of trust, we naturally maintain a position of humanity. I invite you to think about that for a moment, see if you disagree, or if you can see the point of view. Maybe if you can even feel how that might change your interactions, especially the difficult ones.
Yeah, I could see, I mean, when you were sort of saying like there are tools for this, like then it becomes more about awareness of you and using those tools to kind of bring yourself back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really that. It's exactly that.
So, I'm thinking about technology and just how the world is changing right now. Like, how has the concept of trust in business evolved with just all of the evolution of technology right now that we're in?
The big story is that the trust economy has allowed us to move from a default position of distrust, which, sure, we experience quite often, to a default position of trust, which is another way of saying, I think, that technology has allowed humans to do the trusting, and it takes on the distrusting, so to speak. So technology, through data and through intermediation, for example, online platforms and ratings and reviews and all of that, which is really where my research began way back, is allowing us to create a foundation of trust. And that can be experienced as very rewarding. Of course, it is not perfect. And also, these organizations run often in a classic shareholder market where they too have to abide by the same rules as everyone else. And those rules can often feel like a heck of a lot of checks and balances. So there is also, that side. However, when we just look at the platforms in isolations, they really have allowed us to make friends around the world, to do business around the world. And as a result, technology has also, I believe, created an expectation of reducing what I call the tax on trust. The tax on trust is sort of the time, money, and data that we spend on what I would say removing distrust or minding distrust and overcoming that to be able to have the level of trust we need. I'd put this even more generally, the level of trust we need in order to do business. Whether it is something you want to sell, or you would like your brand to grow with your customers or consumers, or you simply would like to elevate your position. All of those require that we are sort of uplifted with a sort of buoyancy of trust. Distrust is something that weighs us down. And so it goes back to choosing how much weight do we want to carry ourselves, or how much weight are we willing and able to delegate to technology. In the same way that, if you take construction equipment, right? Construction equipment can lift a lot more weights than an individual or even a lot of humans can do. So the analogy goes that distrust is a heavy weight, and technology can carry that heavy weight. And more so, humans can carry it too when we cooperate. For example, you may not be able to lift a car, but if there's enough people working in tandem, it becomes possible. So there are really two major points here. One is technology allows us to basically carry a lot more weight without having to carry it, meaning the technology carries the weight, and we can sort of feel a lot lighter as a result of that. And trust can come easier and be the concentration of the human interaction. It can be about trust. At the same time, collaboration also allows us to do some heavy lifting. But more beautifully than that, collaboration also really flourishes when an atmosphere of trust is already there. So I believe technology is beautiful in both cases. First, to individually lift weight off our shoulders, the weight of distrust, so that we can trust. And then, as a second, quite natural step, for us to become more collaborative. This is also the two books I wrote. The Trust Economy is really about how technology lifts the weight off our shoulders. And then Reset is a book about how collaboration actually wins over competition and how we can show that in industries. Yeah.
Really interesting. I love the analogy of the weight and technology lifting that weight. And also interesting to think about how it actually fosters collaboration, like you're saying, around the world. I mean, we're across the world from each other right now and able to have this conversation and collaborate. And that's a result of technology, a beautiful thing, right?
Exactly.
But, I'm thinking, we talk to people in the industry all the time about positioning, marketing, messaging, and sort of what are the claims that all different companies are making, technology companies, I'm the best at this, or I do this differently than anyone else. And there's a lot of distrust in that, in the messaging that's sort of out in the industry. Like, who do I know actually is doing what they say they're doing? And so I'm curious your take on that. Like, how do you think about, as a business or as a marketer, sort of fostering that trust and making sure that your positioning and messaging is authentic in a sea of sort of everybody saying the same thing a lot of the times?
Yeah. Jen, I appreciate that you use the word fostering trust, because I do occasionally caution against using the word building trust. The reason is that when there is an atmosphere of distrust, there is a sense of hostility. It's like one at that moment lacks safety. And at that moment, any trust offering is just going to be met with the same skepticism as anything else before. So before we can ever really work with this foundation of trust, we in a way have to remove the distrust. I, however, think that the reason human beings distrust and the reason brands claim things they may, ambitiously one day hope to hold is because there is a sort of resource, there is a sort of competency in that. What I mean by that is this is done because it is seen perhaps as the only option or the best option. So the funny thing is, in a way there, we trust distrust. So our trust in distrust sometimes is higher than our trust in trust. And what I mean by that especially is that we should listen to that. If we trust distrust, it means that trusting trust is not yet possible. So the first step for us, in order for us to be able to trust trust as a way, is to remove distrust. And that for a brand also typically leads to what I would call 3 horizons of differentiation. One is the power of symbol. What do I mean by that? The power of symbol is to use cultural symbols which are meaningful to us to communicate a certain purpose, for lack of a better word, a certain orientation for the brand. I use the example in the keynote of the peace symbol, which is very universal. The reason is that there is an existing network of ideas and thoughts in the person's mind about this, something that is quite universal. And if I manage as a brand to sort of piggy on, I'm holding on to like a hot air balloon and it can lift me up, which is very beautiful. The second one is the power of metaphor. Metaphors work in a similar way, but what they do is essentially they allow us to quickly construct a complex idea. Right? So when we talked about the heavy lifting or the weight off the shoulders and technology lifting weight like a crane in a construction site, it's ultimately a metaphor for communicating an otherwise quite perhaps complex idea. Therefore, the idea becomes resolved into a sort of very simple, I get that, because I already understand it at another level. So I already have everything I need to understand this. That can be a great relief for leaders as well, and for marketers especially, because it means I don't have to learn anything new. With the power of metaphor, I, and thus also my audiences, can already appreciate me because I'm using a metaphor which is known. So I'm tapping into an understanding which is already there. That makes it simpler for everyone. And the final one is the power of truth. By that I mean, as a brand, how can I reveal your greatness to you without taking credit? How can I show you, Jen, that you actually are a lot more capable even than you think? That there are a lot of aspects about you that perhaps I can help reveal, I can help support, I can help you flourish in certain ways. And this is really what a lot of social media initially once intended to do, and what a lot of great brands nowadays still do. They give us, for lack of a better word again, a platform upon which to flourish, a platform or perhaps even an opportunity to reveal our own talents, our own abilities in a much bigger way to us than we, every day operate on them. And this really is helpful because that way brands become resources for individuals to recognize their own resources. And those brands, I believe, create what I would call mind monopolies. So basically, they are so valuable because of what they enable, what they empower in people, that we sort of, in a way, just concentrate on them. And we start perhaps even falling in love with them. And that's all right. Or we really, really just think they're doing the right thing. What then happens, quite naturally, is that those brands we take with us, and those brands we also speak about. This, I think, is essential, because nowadays, who really gets share of voice? I really, really, really believe that share of voice comes from truth. And what I mean by that specifically is the truth that brands reveal in their audience, because there is a great amount of gratitude that I can have for that. When a brand shows me a side of myself that is really good and that I didn't know or didn't think about for a long time.
I think that last bit is so key, because what you're not saying is that these brands are delivering truth about what they offer or what's their products do, exactly. Or it's not about them, right? It's about what they create for their audience or for their customers.
Yeah, this would be jobs theory in the innovation space where I come from. So the idea is that we use brands and products and services for as means to an end, which initially sounds a bit transactional, but actually it just means that we already know brands are being defined, like any communication is being defined by the people receiving it. Thus, we already know this is the case. So we can simply play to that truth. And that is, in fact, at another level, also a playing with truth and, the power of truth. Now, I am all for brands also being super honest in what they are doing. That's another dimension. I'd say maybe it's a little bit of another tab to open. I typically use the comparison of trusted versus trustworthy. There are brands that are very good at being trusted, meaning they invite us, often with distrust patterns, funnily enough, to give them their money, data, and time. But this is a short-term solution, because the other side of the medal is also being trustworthy. Now, the confusion in society comes from taking those both to be the same thing. The example I often use is that of a squirrel. Let's say you're in the park and there is a squirrel and you think it's cute, and you open your hand like this and you say, "Dear squirrel, please sit on my hand." Now, I would 100% vouch for that you are going to treat the squirrel nicely. So you are absolutely trustworthy. And yet the squirrel, in all odds, might take a long time or will never actually sit on your hand, because the squirrel comes from a position of, well, I don't know if I can actually trust that person. So trustworthy as you may be, the squirrel may not yet consider you trusted. And that's quite interesting, because this gap is really important. So as a brand, you may be the good person. You may do all the right things, but this gives you only one side of the medal, which is the trustworthiness. If you want trustedness, and you want to achieve trustedness with trust instead of by trusting distrust. So if you want to win with trust, if you want to mind the distrust and sort of, remove that as much as possible, then what do? Then the strategies of, going with symbol, metaphor, and the power of truth can be really, really valuable, because those are all ways of winning with trust on your side. At least they should be. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The sort of that gap between trusted and trustworthy. Because you're right, you could be the most trustworthy, but if you've not sort of shown that you can be trusted, I see that for sure. I'm curious, you've advised for a lot of unicorn status businesses, tech businesses. What role did trust play in their growth strategies for those businesses?
The key role is that an industry, this is my theory, so you may well disagree with it, it's no problem. My theory is that an industry which is ripe for disruption is an industry characterized by a high level of distrust. A high level of distrust in the culture of the organization is one example. A high level of distrust in my customers is another example, meaning I don't trust that those customers know what they're doing. I think they have to be forced to buy this product, right? They have to be marketed to the end of time until they buy this product, right? That would be an attitude of distrust. Or I'm going to lock them into a long contract so they can't escape after I've hard sold them whatever I wanted to sell them. That's an attitude of distrust, right? And so in those industries tend to be gridlocked and constricted. And then when a new player comes into the picture and uses technology to restore trust, which is to say to return trust to the customer, here is a platform, or here is something, a product that recognizes that, first of all, you are a competent human being and we value your input and we know that you know what is good for you. Now, we also offer you a technology so that we can actually be much more streamlined in your interactions. We can be much more trusting in our interactions. We trust you to stay with us, so we give you the flexibility to cancel. Those are all simple examples, especially in the two companies that I kind of advised, particularly which grew very, 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 very big. One was really kind of doing this in the telco space. They removed the minimum contract requirement, and they turned around the equation from telcos using the customer data for their advantage to ultimately giving the customer as much data as possible, so that really that data could empower them. So the first recipe, to sort of recap this, is an industry characterized by what I would call pathological inflationary distrust, meaning too much of that thing, right? Too much of a thing. The analogy I use, which is tangential but can be maybe helpful, is water. In water, if it's entirely without salt, it can be a little bit difficult. If it has a little bit of minerals, a little bit of salt, it's good. But if there's too much salt, the water becomes completely useless. As in, if you drink it, you become more thirsty. So it would be spoiled at that point, right? This is exactly the same, that typically in industries, a little bit of distrust is pretty much unavoidable. But if it gets too much, the entire industry becomes, it sort of grinds to a halt. And startups can take advantage of that by sort of giving us what we really crave, which is environments where we can trust. Just like imagine in your family, if there's an environment of deep and intense trust, that's the kind of environment we want. And that's also the environment which gives our brain the right sort of conditions to really, really feel at ease and peace. So it's actually a very, very deeply motivating thing. We can talk about the neuroscience. I picked up a really interesting piece recently on that. But that's sort of the first thing. The second part, though, and this is timing related, is that technologies suddenly open up windows of opportunity. And so when all of a sudden a technology comes online that allows us at scale to remove distrust in an interaction that beforehand had a lot of distrust. For example, let's take moderation, right? Content moderation. Beforehand, we had to basically do this via people. With AI possibilities, this has become a lot easier. As a result, of course, the human beings in the organization can spend a lot more time actually looking after their stakeholders, because the difficult task of moderating content can actually be delegated to technology. And this is an experientially much better result for the people that have to moderate content, but also for the content that is being moderated, because as a result, there is a much faster interaction, right? As a result, the people that do have this role can be focusing on interacting with users instead of having to look at potentially distressing footage. It's just one example, but this is an example that most of us might know in the traditional term of trust and safety. It's a good example because it shows how technology can really work in tandem with us. And this is also, I think, why we trust technology, is that we actually recognize that it is there to help us and that it can be a great support for us. That's a rather long-winded answer, but starting a company and turning it into a unicorn is also not exactly something you do on the weekend in your garage.
Sure.
That's where it may start there, but it's still a very, very sort of abbreviated version of the strategy behind this. But I hope you can appreciate the direction in which this is going. Yeah.
Of course, yeah, it's really interesting to think about identifying the distrust in an industry as a whole.
Exactly. Yes. Where is it? Where is the gap?
Right.
Which is the most painful distrust that you and I experience? This is actually, thank you so much for bringing this up, because you really landed it there for me. For our audience, for our audience, right? In your industry, or in your product, in your proposition, where do you hypothesize is a sort of friction point of distrust, where you and the customer, or you and your stakeholder, have some sort of distrust? You feel this because usually it feels heavy then. It feels almost like that you're a bit constricted and frozen in those moments. Even if you go through them mentally, you can feel your response in the body, that when suddenly something makes you sort of freeze and constrict, that can be typically a distrust pain point. So if you can address that, that can actually be a way in which you can turn around step by step those interactions, and that can actually create a huge uplift for your brand and, well, in the sake of growth for your business, right?
Sure.
So that's a very, very simple technique, intuitive technique that you can apply.
Yeah. It's interesting. I just had a conversation last week with someone at a company that I hadn't spoken to before, and they were describing to me the work that they're doing. And I said to them, this is such an interesting time, because the industry right now, there's a lot of fear around this particular technology and fraud and, data quality. And there's all this stress about this topic. And what you're doing is the solution to that. It's the antithesis. But, they just need help to kind of communicate that and get people to know that they're solving this problem in a unique way. But I think, too, I'm curious how you capitalize on, maybe that's the right or wrong word, the distrust in an industry in a trustworthy way, right? Like, how do you go into it in an authentic kind of, not use those patterns of distrust to capitalize on that opportunity?
I find it brilliant to utilize something which we experience as problematic so that we can turn it around. I think that is the pioneering spirit of change. So I value that. So if you as audience also think, oh, well, yes, this whole distrust, I can now basically position myself strategically and offer an alternative. Well, exactly right. That's something which is, I guarantee you, is very likely to be appreciated. How do I do it? Well, first of all, I think a little bit of inner search and also search in your work environment can be really, really helpful. Like, where do I experience distrust? Or if I were to look at the product itself, where could distrust linger in the product? So where are perhaps interactions, maybe accidentally, or maybe because of necessity, sort of creating an atmosphere of distrust? There, I can then figure out, well, how do I work with technology that is already there to see if there is already a technology that can actually help me bridge that. As it comes to startups, though, right? Startups often have the solution, which means they are trustworthy, perhaps, but not necessarily trusted. There, the question is, am I basically, and a very simple example here, let's assume that your friend has one of those bikes where you can sit on the back, right? I grew up in Europe, it's a thing, that's how we went to school and everything, and to uni. And let's say they're coming towards you at full speed, right? Like 30 kilometers an hour, whatever that is in miles. And you hold your hand out, and they're sort of like, they grab you by the hand, right? Might be well meant, but it's likely going to be less of a nice experience for you and also for them, because ultimately there is this inertia that you are both at different speeds. The same is true for a startup that comes into an established industry. And when I was in the Fortune 500 seats, basically I had to navigate that all the time. That startups come in with a very, very fast pace, with a very fast solution. So they are on the bike, right? And they're trying to hold out the hand. But then, the person that is standing there is anticipating a great disaster because they feel they're going to get pulled along, and they haven't necessarily felt that that person is going to take the time to stop and meet me where I am, and then we're going to journey together. And this actually is the faster way of doing it, and of course it minimizes the potential side effects. So that turns a otherwise quite challenging, hardening dynamic of negotiation that often goes into conflict in the wrong way, to one where we meet also in a space where we can first of all calibrate. That I think is essential. Then that gives us space also to adjust our language. Corporate language can be quite different, in my experience, to startup language. And then the interest that is there on both sides can actually be gently woven into a lattice work. It's the same story with human relationships. If the first few seconds you meet someone, you right away ask them to marry you, typically that would be perceived as slightly problematic, right? In my culture, that's how it is.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting, like all of what you're talking about is sort of has this layer of, like, dare I say, empathy, just kind of meeting people where they are and looking at opportunities for collaboration and calibration. I love that word that you use. Like, there is a sense of like understanding who your customers are and what their needs are. Where is that distrust? How can you offer a solution to it? Like, it's maybe a little bit about looking outside and finding some empathy and looking for opportunities for improvement.
100%. I personally am very wary and even like kind of finding it a bit exhausting to be confronted with messages all day long of people that have never met me, of companies that have never done business with me, effectively telling me how I ought to live, what I ought to need, and what really would make my life better. I don't know if you feel that too, but in as much as I understand that there is a respectable hustle behind that, and I understand that there's even good intention potentially behind that, I find it can be quite counterintuitive, but also very, very rewarding to take a step back and do it the other way around, which is you as a customer, you are a smart and competent person. Let's just assume that. Let's just go out on a limb and assume that for once, that you are actually a smart and competent and resourceful individual because, well, you're living your life and you're doing fairly good at it, right? Okay, let's take that assumption. Now, what might you need from us? And how can we show you aspects of yourself that are really highlights, which you didn't see? Right? How can we give you a better way than to run on distrust mode all the time? How can we detox you from that distrust and give you something better? Something that universally, in my experience, people want. Would you like to be an environment of trust, or would you like to be an environment of distrust? Would you like to have to argue with companies about whether, you have a right to your opinion about their product? Very simple example, right? Or would you rather have an honest, a candid conversation with them? Would you rather they actually for once listened to your feedback and listen to your suggestions. Wouldn't you really love if someone actually cared about your idea for how to make your favorite product better? And if there was someone on the other side who said, hey, you know what? That's actually a really good idea. We have lost, unfortunately, a little bit of that connection. And I think even if you say, trust, that's important for my family, but maybe not so important for work. Actually, even if we were to simply look at it as an instrument for greater humanity, that's already more than enough to work with. And it would so transform the way we experience our everyday. Because I reckon, I don't know you, but I reckon that you, once upon a time, and hopefully still today, have this idea, I want to do something great, I really want to make a contribution to the world. I want to do something that makes people, if not happy, that makes them delighted and joyful and content. And perhaps you have experienced in your career, as I have, that ideal way of working isn't always the case in a corporate environment, isn't always the case in the market that chases quarters where necessary, and isn't always the case because for some reason we have told ourselves that it is not possible. And yet, a little bit of investigation and a little bit of a change of tack can have a very profound result in revealing to us as well that it is very well possible and that it is in fact a great way to do business.
Yeah, so interesting. And I think what you say about, this is great sort of for my personal life, but, maybe not so much in work. And I'm curious, like, how you think about actually maybe demonstrating the impact of trust. We are in a world where everything has to be measured, right? And there's OKRs and KPIs. And how do you measure the impact of something that maybe is slightly less tangible, like trust building or fostering in terms of actual business impact?
I want to pick up what you just said about this being, valuable personally and professionally. I will admit that thinking systemically about this, I firmly believe that there are relationships between professional and personal experience. And I think that that's also good because wherever this has use potentially to you in your life, it will actually translate into other aspects of life. So trust is really a wonderful resource, and it can give you a great deal even if you initially try this out in a very, very safe and kind of a comfortable environment. It can already really shift your perspective. In terms of measuring it, I'd like to give two alternatives. One is the one that I would actually prefer, which is from the heart. The sort of way of understanding trust is the experience of trust. I am going to be almost certainly sure that you have had many experiences in your life where you felt a sense of trust, an experience of trust. And that simple experience, to you that might be time-boxed in a memory. But when you retrieve the memory, you may find that it is still there. And if then, with a little bit of, the reflective questions are one way, one key that one can use, if you can then see if you can make that experience of that really, really trusted memory, if you can make that present, and if you can, let's call it imagine it right now, right? If you could do that, then you might actually feel that actually your experience of an interaction is changing as a result of that. And so that, to me, it's still the most persuasive thing for a human being, because when that happens at scale, that's why I open keynotes with it typically. I kind of like start and do this as a group exercise with the room. Sometimes we lift our arms up, and then it really, really helps to bring us concentrated into a moment of inner peace and joy. That to me is a very simple example that a very diverse group of people, diverse perspectives, diverse backgrounds, maybe even conflicts in the team, conflicts in the interaction, within 2 minutes can each in their own way share a universal sentiment of peace. And from that, a natural atmosphere of trust. I guarantee you, with that little bit of effort, naturally collaboration will be much easier. The ice is broken, People will start from that perspective, bringing in their best sides, because when I trust that you have great resources to bring, and you trust that I have great resources to bring, we are vastly more productive. And so that would be the second, albeit to me it's the indirect way of measuring it. The indirect way of measuring it is to actually look at your collaboration and to then look at your productivity. And I would go out on a limb and I'd say, if you were to work with even some of what you have picked up today, your team productivity and your productivity would go up. And it might take time, but it would significantly go up, because we know that distrust is a constrictive force. That much I do know. And that constrictive force leads to more friction, and more friction means more energy has to be fed into the system, and the system wears and tears faster, like a car, really. You take the resistance off. And to me, the most valuable thing that I experience day-to-day life is when I feel a weight, a resistance, a tension lifted. And trust is the way to do that. That I'm certain.
Yeah, I love that. And, thinking about like this sort of maybe qualitative measure of productivity and collaboration. And I imagine that just makes everybody more creative as well, when there aren't those restrictions and people feeling closed off. It's, you're free to, we do this all the time. We talk about a worst possible idea, and we have, space to come up with the worst possible idea, because that's often where the best ideas are. But just letting go of that fear of, oh, that idea is not good enough or whatever, it just, creates more creativity. And then all the other metrics that you're already measuring, that should lift altogether. And like you said, maybe it takes some time,
Yes.
but
it does. It can also be instant. So it's really about how much you want to double down on measuring trust. You can measure brand trust if you want, and you will find an uplift in pretty much all the brand metrics you care about. So I don't say this because trust is the only thing that matters. Far from it. But what one must appreciate, I think, is that trust is a meta metric, which means this is a metric that when you improve that metric, all the other metrics that you care about guaranteed improve as well. Why? Because trust is an enabler of humanity, is an enabler of human performance. It's as simple as that. If you as an athlete try to go for the Olympics, which I haven't done, but let's just say, and you don't trust that you have a chance to win, how likely do you think it is? At some level, you must have internalized that your skill actually is there, right? So you must trust it. Your coach must trust it. Probably your team members must trust it. It is very intuitive, but it's also super logical. Let's face it, it is super logical. So trust actually also, by concentrating on it, allows us to really, really actually make our life a lot easier. Because if I manage to uplift a meta metric, I can actually be fairly sure that my other metrics are improving. And I don't even have to admit it, For me, it is fine if you say, I'm going to measure whatever I've always measured because those are my KPIs, those are my OKRs, whatever. That's fine. In fact, that's good, right? But let trust be your secret weapon, I call it the human superpower, right? You don't even have to talk about it. But if someone asks you, so what's your secret sauce? Or, how do you explain that things have just been going smoother? Then if you want, you can share it. It's up to you, I'm a great fan of demonstrating results and then sharing about what those results were originated by. Yeah, that's one way to do it.
For sure. And I feel like, as you're talking about this like sort of secret human superpower and this meta metric that sort of lives underneath other things, like for me, like hearing you speak in Athens and even having this conversation now, it's, trust is not something I'm overly conscious of in my day to day. I'm not thinking about, am I in a space of trust or distrust, so that awareness and sort of bringing it to the forefront is so interesting, and sort of, how am I going to apply this today? And that reminder, like this is going to have an impact if you can set yourself right, take that 2 minutes like you described, or, actually I'd love to hear if there are other sort of trust building activities that you'd recommend. And those tools you mentioned, there are tools. But that awareness, I just had made a big impact on me for sure.
Yeah, that's beautiful, and then you already have a very powerful tool in your hands. For those interested, I can certainly explain it properly at some point. I think it's even recorded as well. There is an entire toolbox that I use, and it really is, basically, what are you trying to fix? That's the tool that basically is brought to bear. And there are tools for removing distrust. And there are then tools for facilitating this natural motion of winning with trust, which is quite human as such. So to really make it simple, I want to pick up something you said, Jen, which is that you don't think about trust much every day. But may I say, is it correct to say that it's sort of there, like as in it's an intuitive? It is an intuitive. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just not in your forefront of your consciousness at any given time necessarily. Like it's there.
Yes. And that's also because the part of our brain that is typically, let's just say in charge of fear, of distrust, is, it doesn't really have much to do with language, right? So this is interesting. Trust, at an intellectual, rational level, of course, is something we can speak about. But really, it is, in the deeper understanding of our being, it is that experience of trust. And intuitively, we know when we feel distrust and we know when we feel trust. We know the difference. So it's already there, which means thinking about it just allows us to tune in to something which is already happening within us. And allows us to avail those, I would say, a very deep ocean of inner resources in a much more appreciative and sort of, competent way. So in a way, it also means that this is really an invitation to trust the way that we trust and to understand what we distrust. There is something that we need, and to value that, to appreciate that equally in another person. If they are distrusting, there is something that they need. One tool that I find very, very, very powerful, if one is willing to understand it, is the tool of what I call the flight height. Very simple. Trust can be as simple as I trust myself, right? Individual. Trust can also be in a group. Trust can be in an idea. Ideas are usually a little bit higher because ideas are typically only valuable when they are shared with people. Or I can trust the government. I can trust my CEO. I can trust in a big universal idea. So I can trust, let's call it, if I may, at different levels, at different flight heights. I can trust in a very, very, personal way, or I can trust in a very, very big, inclusive way. Now, if I were to meet you, right, and you are someone who just, maybe in that moment, really, really loves this idea that you are very, very immersed in, right? And so your trust is entirely at that level, right? Let's say you are a startup and you have a wonderful solution and you're super enthusiastic about it. And you're meeting a prospect, and that prospect has a previously commissioned an IT project. And that IT project failed. They went with a big, maybe kind of big company, and it completely failed and it cost them a lot of money. And then they went with a startup and maybe it failed as well. And so that person now is coming into that same interaction, and you're talking very, very charismatically about your beautiful idea. And, really it's, how could one not get this, right? And then the other person is sitting there frozen and just like hostile in some way, or at least just really, really hesitant because they're like, oh crap, this is the same thing again. Remember when that other company was talking about the big idea and how great it was and world peace? And so there we are again noticing a discrepancy. And there I, as a person that in this case would wish for trust to be present, need to understand why is that other person, probably very intuitively, probably without being so aware of it. Why are they reacting the way they do? And then it allows me to recognize distrust in the people around that I work with. And then I can actually there start with ways of offering the person ways in which that distrust can be removed, ways of being personally reassuring. So there I can take it down to the individual, one-on-one level, and sort of figure out, what does this person really need? What would they need to feel safe? How can I get them out of the context that they might be stuck in? And for that, I need to also get out of my context that I might be, stuck in. That is a really, really powerful technique. You mentioned empathy. I think that's a wonderful word of really understanding how that can allow us to level. Because if one person's trust is very, very big picture and one person's trust is very pragmatic survival, which means it might just be really kind of, a sort of very, very, distrust type of, a trust in distrust, if you will. Right? We had that. Then those worlds have to meet before they can even really communicate properly. And that, I think, is true for brands as well. You don't know necessarily you might not know how people experience your category or how they've experienced products that they associate with you. And there also, I think, in the B2B world, originality is so important. Being original.
Yes.
So that you can invite people to manufacture a context of your own, that you can live in their minds in a world of your own. That's very useful. And then that world you can, enrich and pepper and spice with symbols and metaphors and truths that you and your audience believe in. And then you are basically in La La Land. But let's be honest, as a marketer, who wouldn't want that? Isn't that why we initially became marketers if we are marketers? We want to be playful and joyful and, tell great stories. That I believe that could be what a marketer might want to do in their life, right? And I actually believe that's a very human thing. Like humans, we like to play and be joyful and do something that is valuable. So it really comes all the way back to that, to be more of what we already are by recognizing that in ourselves and in the people that we meet, really. Yeah.
I love that, and this differentiation that you described, like to set yourself apart from maybe those things that people have tried in the past that haven't worked. You're not, now another same version of the thing that didn't work for that person in the past. Like you've now sort of carved out your own space to occupy in their minds, which is, that's the goal. We all want to be that.
Jen, exactly that. There's a very strategic move here. It's a very subtle move. I'll help explain it. Maybe some of you have already picked it up. The subtle move is this, that in terms of what I present to my audience, there I'm going to be as original as I possibly can be on the one hand, so that I can really, imagine a world of my own. And that world should be inviting to customers, to my audience. At the same time, I also draw on what in the public domain are already positive, helpful associations that naturally fit. And so I go from both sides. I work with ideas and concepts which are already positively associated, which draw positive memories and positive associations in the person's mind. But I do it respectfully. I do it because I actually understand, okay, this seems like it is valuable to you. So I am going to give you an opportunity to be more of that, to experience more of that, to feel more of that. And I trust that in itself is more than worth it for you to say, this brand, I really like them. Perhaps I love them. So I will stick with them. I will root for them, and I will spread the word about them. And so that is about the drive for originality is balanced with a very, very sensible understanding for what's already a source of trust in your audience's life. And that association, when it is done ethically and respectfully and with the good intentions of your audience in mind, is a supremely powerful technique.
Amazing. Feels like a really good place to end the conversation here today. I can't thank you enough. As I mentioned to you before we, started, this is such a topic that I just don't feel like many people talk about. And like you said, it's not one that necessarily needs words all the time, but so powerful to really dig deep on it and think about the impact that trust has on brands and businesses and people as a whole. So thank you so much for coming and sharing with us today.
Thanks a lot, Jen. I greatly enjoyed the way that you led us where we are now.
Amazing. Thank you, everyone, for listening in to today's episode. I'll be back with another one